Well, hello there, folks. Professor Bates here. I wanted to talk a little bit about the two short stories that you're analyzing. A Good Man's Hard to Find and Good Country People. So let's take the first story, A Good Man is Hard to Find. Now, this is O'Connor's most famous story. It's really the one that she's known for. And it came in a collection with the same title. A Good Man is Hard to Find. Now, there's actually an old song from the 50s by that same title, and she might have been trying to be a little ironic when she used it. But let's talk about the title for a second. Why is it so hard to find a good man? Um, well, maybe because everybody has a different definition of what good means. That could be one thing. Let's think about Flannery O'Connor because we need to find her in this story. Well, if you've watched the background video on her, you know that Flannery O'Connor was a devout Christian. She was raised as a Catholic in the American South, Georgia, and she went to mass every day, and she was a very devout Christian. Now, she was also a writer, and she wanted to write stories that people would actually read. Well, the thing that she has often been quoted as saying is that the reason her stories are so violent is because she believed that violence is what reveals a person's true nature. You can't really hide when you're faced with death or something like that. So let's take a look at the story and see if we can find Flannery O'Connor in a couple of ways. One, this story is a journey story. It's a story of a family who goes on a vacation. They're headed to Florida. They get lost, and their car flips over a couple of times, and they're, rescued, if you want to look at it that way, by some really bad people. Um, all of these characters have bad things about them, they're not particularly good. The children are kind of rebellious, they're not very respectful to their elders. Um, the grandmother is pious, but not really putting into practice what she says. She sees a little black child with no clothes on, and all she can say is, "Well, gosh, I wish I could take a picture of that." She's not sympathetic to poverty. Um, the family is white, and they are navigating some parts of the South that are populated by an awful lot of African Americans, but they seem very apart and different from these folks. Um, Along the way of this journey, they see these signs. And, this is something you used to see a lot in the Old South. Occasionally, you'll still see them today. Um, Little Bible verses or things that are just, meant to remind you to live a good life, a good Christian life. If you're not, well, you're probably going to go straight to hell. And, that is, I think, another thing that Flannery O'Connor put into her story purposely. She did feel like we had to act a certain way, but she also saw that a lot of people don't do that. And she was maybe a little puzzled about why that's the case. Now, after they have the car wreck, they are, quote unquote, rescued by three very bad men, the Misfit and his gang. These guys are desperate. They've escaped from jail. They are killers. They are murderers. But the Misfit is a complicated character. He's not just a mindless serial killer. He has some intelligence. He thinks he's innocent. Um, there are some things that, get a little bit convoluted here when we try to figure out, well, why do these bad guys come in contact with this family? We kind of find out the flaws of both, the Misfit and his gang, but also the family individually in this confrontation. So again, I think she's trying to teach us some moral lessons here about what it means to be good and who is good and what does good mean. Let's look at the characters. This is a good way to analyze for your essay. If you want to say, well, how can I find Flannery O'Connor? Well, she created these characters, so that's got to come from her experience. I would say likely the grandmother represents some of the people that she saw in her hometown. They pretended to be good Christians, but when it came right down to it, they didn't really practice what they preached. The grandmother is fairly arrogant. She does go to church, but it's more a case of looking good and dressing well and impressing the neighbors than really learning anything about Christ's teachings. She sees it as a social situation, and she's also very judgmental of people and their clothing. Again, I mentioned the little black boy with no breeches on. She kind of sees him as a non-human. She calls him a pickaninny. She's using the lack of clothing to look down on this child. When she first sees the misfit, she mistakenly thinks that maybe he's a smart guy because he's wearing glasses. Well, those glasses are probably something he took off of somebody he killed. He's wearing the clothes of other people. He's a devil in disguise. But the grandmother doesn't recognize that. And, right before she dies, she even calls him one of my babies. She thinks maybe this is a lost child of hers. She's really confused, I think, by the misfit. She can't understand why this guy doesn't treat her like a lady. Now, the misfit's also a complicated character. He is, again, a escaped convict. He's wearing a shirt that doesn't belong to him, pants that don't belong to him. Likely he took off his prison garb and stole some clothes from some people. So he's in disguise. He does not look like a killer, but he definitely is a killer. It's hard to recognize, remember the title, A Good Man is Hard to Find. The grandmother mistakes him for a good man. She even pleads with him, I know you're a good man. And he says, no, ma'am, I'm not good. So again, we get to this idea of hypocrites, people who don't really act the way they look, using exterior features to try to judge a person's soul. You just can't do that. Unfortunately, a lot of people do. And I think this is where the grandmother has a real problem with the misfit. She thinks she can reason with him, but she obviously cannot. And I think the big climax comes when the grandmother is begging for her life, pleading for her life. I know you're a good man. I know you're one of my babies. And he shoots her dead. Now, maybe you could say that in that moment before she's killed, she becomes a good person. Like Christ, maybe she had to die to ascend to heaven. Maybe the misfit is the thing that saves her. You could look at all this as kind of an analogy for Christianity and some of the tenets of Christianity. It's a very key scene. And I think, O'Connor put it in there for a very good reason to try to depict some of her religious beliefs. Finally, one of the last lines of the book is one of the gang members says, boy, she sure was a talker, wasn't she? And the misfit, after he shot her, says, well, if it had been somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life, she would have been a good person. In other words, she only became good when faced with death. And I guess the way he looks at it, she really wasn't a very good person until she was faced with, the ultimate end. And that may be what it takes in some cases to obtain grace. Remember, the word grace means getting a gift that you don't ask for and you don't deserve. kind of a dark way to look at it, but I think again, she's trying to modernize. Flannery O'Connor is trying to modernize some of these Christian concepts. So I would say, look at the characters and the situations in A Good Man's Hard to Find, and I think you'll definitely see some things in there that reflect Flannery O'Connor. All right, let's look at the second story, Good Country People. This is the one you have to download. How can we find Flannery O'Connor in this story? Well, this is a very weird story, about a farm family who's visited by a traveling salesman. And I think one of the main characters is the daughter, Joy, who goes away to college and she gets a PhD in philosophy, which means she's a smart lady, but she has a disability. She's missing a leg. She has a wooden leg. She can't get a job. So she moves back in with her mom. And she just goes around judging everybody. She's smarter and better than anyone that she knows, including this traveling salesman who comes to her door named Manly Pointer. Now, she thinks Manly is just a dumb hick, a guy who believes in Christianity because he's just stupid. She's smarter than that. She's been to college. She knows what's what. And she decides that she's going to finally get herself a boyfriend and she's going to seduce Manly Pointer. Well, it actually turns out the other way. He attempts to seduce her. Which brings us to the story of this guy who comes to the door selling Bibles. Now, obviously, in today's world, we probably wouldn't run into a Bible salesman, but back in the 50s, it wasn't that unusual. But Manly Pointer is an imposter. He is not a good Christian. He's actually a swindler. He's a guy who uses religion to get in the door and then steals things. So he's using religion as a cloak, a disguise. And I think, certainly even in the 50s, O'Connor saw some of these televangelists, these preachers on TV and radio, who really were just interested in money. They were using religion to enrich themselves, and she thought that was a very dangerous and terrible thing. So again, that's a situation and a character, Manly Pointer, that I think you can point to. Why did she make Holga, the character Joy Holga, disabled? Well, just, remember from the biography that Flannery O'Connor was disabled herself. She had lupus. She lost the use of her legs at one point. She didn't like being disabled. She didn't like being singled out for her disability. And so likely, this is a character that she created to kind of, show people what it's like to be different, to look physically different from people, and to have that kind of shame and things going on in your life. You have to look at the key scene, I think, up in the hayloft when Manly is going to try to seduce Holga. And what we find out is he's really interested in taking her wooden leg. He's got a collection of things that he's gotten from disabled women, a glass eye and other things. His Bible is deceptive. It's hollowed out, and inside his Bible is whiskey and condoms. Well, what does that say? He is a guy who is using religion for his own human purposes. And yet he outsmarts a college-educated woman who really is kind of a little girl. She doesn't have a lot of real-life romantic stories to tell. And so even Manly is able to kind of get one over on her. So then I think it goes back to the idea of, what is a real Christian? What is good Christian behavior? Why do we try to deceive each other? Where does that come from? These are all questions that I think Flannery O'Connor would definitely want you to try to understand. And that's a big part of these two stories. So hopefully that helps a little bit. Again, it's no substitute for reading them, but I think it might at least unveil a couple of themes that you can think about. All right, guys, good luck. Keep writing, get that works cited turned in, and the essay is due shortly after. Bye bye.